The morning of June 18, 1944, aboard the flagship Taiho in the Philippine Sea, Lieutenant Commander Masatake Okumiya stood in the intelligence briefing room, reviewing reconnaissance reports that made no sense. His hands trembled slightly as he cross-referenced the latest sighting data with the Master Fleet Registry. The numbers refused to align with reality. American carriers? Everywhere. Far more than should exist. Task Force 58 had been spotted steaming west of Saipan, and the initial counts were staggering. 7 large fleet carriers, 8 light carriers, 15 flatops in total, their aircraft filling the skies in formations so dense they appeared on radar as solid masses. Okumiya had spent 3 years tracking American naval strength through intelligence intercepts, decoded messages, and reconnaissance photographs. He knew every carrier in the United States Pacific Fleet by name, by silhouette, by the distinctive pattern of their aircraft elevators. He had calculated production rates, estimated construction timelines, and projected American carrier strength for the decisive battle everyone knew was coming. His projections said this was impossible. According to Japanese naval intelligence estimates compiled in early 1944, the Americans possessed perhaps 7 operational fleet carriers in the entire Pacific. The light carriers, converted cruiser hulls mounting smaller air groups, might number another 4 or 5, 12 carriers maximum. The Imperial Navy had war-gamed against this number. They had planned Operation A-Go around this number. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa had sailed with 9 carriers specifically because 9 Japanese carriers, supported by land-based aircraft from the Marianas, could match 12 American carriers. But the reconnaissance reports showed 15 confirmed sightings, and more kept appearing. Okumiya reviewed the data again, searching for duplicate counts, for misidentified battleships, for any explanation that would reconcile observation with expectation. There were none. The American carriers were real. They were modern. And they were accompanied by 7 fast battleships, 13 cruisers, and 58 destroyers, a surface fleet larger than anything Japan could assemble, even if it stripped every base in the Pacific. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The briefing proceeded in hushed tones. Staff officers spoke carefully, avoiding direct acknowledgement of what the numbers meant. Admiral Ozawa listened without expression as intelligence officers presented the American order of battle. When they finished, he asked one question. "Are we certain of the carrier count?" "Yes, Admiral. 15 carriers confirmed, possibly more beyond reconnaissance range." Silence filled the compartment. Every officer present understood naval arithmetic. Japan's mobile fleet carried 430 aircraft across 9 carriers. Task Force 58, with 15 carriers, likely embarked over 900 aircraft. Even accounting for land-based air support from Guam and Tinian, air support that American strikes had been systematically destroying for the past 3 days, the numbers favored the Americans by margins that made victory improbable. But these officers were products of a system that had taught them certain truths about industrial warfare and national capacity. They had been told, repeatedly and authoritatively, that American shipyards could not possibly match Japanese production efficiency. They had been assured that the United States, for all its industrial might, could not build fleet carriers faster than Japan sank them. They had planned this decisive battle on the assumption that American carrier strength had been contained, that Midway and the Solomons campaigns had bled the U.S. Pacific Fleet down to manageable numbers. The reconnaissance report said otherwise, but accepting what those reports meant, truly accepting it, required abandoning beliefs that had been foundational to Japanese naval strategy for 3 years. The confident projections began in late 1941. When Japan opened the Pacific War with 11 aircraft carriers against America's 7. The attack on Pearl Harbor had been designed not just to destroy the U.S. Pacific Fleet's battleships, but to buy time, 18 months, maybe 2 years, for Japan to consolidate its conquests while American shipyards scrambled to rebuild. Japanese naval planners understood that America possessed greater industrial capacity in absolute terms. This was not disputed, but they believed, and their calculations seemed to support this belief, that industrial capacity alone did not translate directly into naval power. Building aircraft carriers required specialized facilities, experienced workers, and years of construction time. The pre-war Yorktown-class carriers had taken 3 years from keel laying to commissioning. The massive Lexington and Saratoga, converted from battlecruiser hulls in the 1920s, represented unique construction opportunities that could not be replicated. Japan, by contrast, had been building carriers since the 1920s and had developed efficient construction techniques and specialized yards. The Shokaku and Zuikaku, completed in 1941, were masterpieces of carrier design, fast, well-protected, capable of operating large air groups. Japanese planners projected they could maintain rough parity in carrier numbers through 1943, by which time the decisive battle would have already occurred, and American will to fight would have collapsed. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 disrupted these calculations but did not destroy them. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers in a single day: Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu. The loss was catastrophic, but Japanese intelligence noted that America had also suffered. Yorktown sunk, Enterprise damaged, Hornet damaged. The carrier exchange ratio, while unfavorable, was not impossible. Japan still possessed Shokaku, Zuikaku, and several light carriers. New construction was underway. The war could continue. Through 1942 and into 1943, Japanese intelligence tracked American carrier movements with meticulous care. They noted when Enterprise was damaged at Santa Cruz in October 1942 and withdrew for repairs. They celebrated when Hornet was sunk in the same battle. They tracked Saratoga through her various torpedo damage repairs that kept her out of action for months at a time. By late 1942, Japanese intelligence assessed that the United States had perhaps 3 operational fleet carriers in the Pacific: Enterprise, Saratoga, and the newly arrived Essex. This assessment was not wildly inaccurate. In November 1942, the U.S. Pacific Fleet indeed operated with limited carrier strength. But Japanese intelligence made a critical error. They projected American construction rates based on pre-war peacetime norms, rather than understanding what American industry could achieve under wartime mobilization. The Two-Ocean Navy Act of 1940, passed before Pearl Harbor, had authorized construction of multiple Essex-class carriers. Japanese intelligence knew this. What they failed to grasp was the speed of American construction and the scale of industrial commitment. In peacetime, building a fleet carrier took 30 to 36 months. Under wartime urgency, with shipyards working 3 shifts and prioritizing carrier construction above all else, American yards cut this time in half. USS Essex herself, the lead ship of her class, was laid down in April 1941 and commissioned in December 1942, 20 months from keel to combat readiness. Her sister ships followed at accelerating pace. Yorktown commissioned in April 1943, Lexington in February 1943, Bunker Hill in May 1943. By the end of 1943, 7 Essex-class carriers were in commission, supplemented by 9 Independence-class light carriers converted from cruiser hulls. Japanese intelligence received reports of these commissioning ceremonies. They read the ship names in intercepted American communications, but they interpreted this data through their own frame of reference, their own construction experience, their own industrial limitations. Surely the Americans could not be building carriers this quickly. Surely some of these reported carriers were propaganda, or misidentified cruisers, or old pre-war ships being renamed. The fundamental Japanese miscalculation rested on a failure to comprehend American industrial mobilization.
Japan's largest carrier building facility, the Kure Naval Arsenal, could construct one fleet carrier
approximately every 18 months when operating at full capacity. This represented the peak of Japanese industrial capability. The arsenal employed thousands of workers, utilized the finest steel Japan could produce, and operated with governmental priority for resources. American shipyards operated under entirely different constraints, or rather, under no comparable constraints at all. Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company in Virginia could build 3 Essex-class carriers simultaneously. Bethlehem Steel's Quincy Yard could build 2. The Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, Norfolk Naval Shipyard, and New York Naval Shipyard all received contracts for Essex-class construction. By 1943, 5 major yards were building fleet carriers in parallel, with construction times dropping to 15 months or less. The USS Hancock, laid down in January 1943, was launched exactly 1 year later and commissioned in April 1944, 15 months total construction time. Her builders had refined techniques pioneered on earlier ships, streamlined workflows, and mobilized worker populations that included thousands of women who had never worked in heavy industry before the war. These workers, often called Rosie the Riveters, welded hull plates, assembled aircraft elevators, installed radar systems, and performed every task in the yard except the heaviest crane operations. Japanese intelligence officers who studied American industrial capacity before the war had produced accurate assessments of peacetime production. They knew American automobile factories produced millions of vehicles annually. They knew American steel mills outproduced Japanese facilities by ratios of 5 to 1 or greater. But they had convinced themselves these advantages were not decisive because warship construction required specialized knowledge and facilities that could not be rapidly expanded. This assumption proved catastrophically wrong. American automobile factories did not just maintain car production while building tanks and aircraft, they converted entirely to military production, applying mass manufacturing techniques to weapons production. The Chrysler Corporation built the Detroit Tank Arsenal specifically to produce Sherman tanks, and that single facility produced more armor in 1943 than all Japanese factories combined. The same principle applied to shipbuilding. American yards expanded, hired massively, and applied industrial efficiency techniques that Japanese planners had not imagined possible. By early 1944, when Admiral Minachi Koga was developing the Z-plan for the decisive battle, Japanese intelligence estimated American carrier strength at approximately 7 fleet carriers plus 4 or 5 light carriers. This estimate was based on confirmed sightings, decoded intercepts, and logical deduction. The Americans had started the war with 7 carriers. They had lost Lexington, Yorktown, Wasp, and Hornet. They had commissioned Essex and her sisters, but surely not more than 6 or 7 of the new class could be operational by mid-1944. The reality was 15 carriers in Task Force 58 alone, with more operating elsewhere in the Pacific, and still more completing construction in American yards. In June 1944, when the Battle of the Philippine Sea commenced, the United States Navy had commissioned 17 Essex-class carriers total, with 15 reaching the combat zone before war's end. Another 7 would be completed after the war from contracts signed in 1942 and 43. This represented industrial capacity operating at a scale Japan simply could not match. Where Japan had built 18 carriers total throughout the entire war, America built 24 Essex-class fleet carriers, plus 9 Independence-class light carriers, plus dozens of escort carriers for convoy protection and amphibious support. The ratio was not 2 to 1 or even 3 to 1. In practical terms, by mid-1944, American carrier production outpaced Japanese production by more than 10 to 1 when accounting for all carrier types. Japanese naval intelligence had the raw data. They had intercepted communications. They had reconnaissance photographs.
but they had interpreted this information through assumptions about industrial possibility that were simply wrong. And now, on June 18th, 1944, reality was steaming toward them with 15 carriers worth of aircraft. The intelligence briefing that shaped Japanese expectations began in Tokyo in January 1944, when the Naval General Staff compiled its comprehensive assessment of American Pacific Fleet strength. The report, classified most secret and distributed only to flag officers, represented months of analysis drawing from submarine reconnaissance, signals intelligence, and reports from neutral shipping that had observed American naval movements. The assessment listed each American carrier by name and estimated operational status. Enterprise, operational, Pearl Harbor. Saratoga, operational, following repairs from torpedo damage. Essex, operational, Central Pacific. Lexington, operational, recently commissioned. The list continued through what intelligence officers believed were perhaps 6 or 7 Essex-class carriers in various stages of shakedown and workup. Total estimated strength, 11 to 12 operational carriers by mid-1944. These numbers seemed reasonable. They aligned with what Japanese planners knew about American pre-war carrier construction timelines. They matched the intercepted communications referring to carrier movements. They fit the intelligence picture built up over 2 years of careful monitoring. What the assessment missed was the fundamental transformation of American shipbuilding. At Newport News Shipbuilding in Virginia, the yard that had built the pre-war
Yorktown in 36 months was now launching Essex-class carriers in 15 months or less. The difference was not subtle improvement. It was revolutionary change in industrial practice. Consider the construction of USS Intrepid, keel laid in December 1941. Workers at Newport News operated in 3 shifts covering 24 hours. The night shift, illuminated by massive floodlights, continued welding hull plates and installing machinery while the day shift slept. Women made up nearly 30% of the workforce by 1943, performing skilled welding and assembly work that pre-war industrial culture had reserved exclusively for men. The yard's cafeterias served hot meals around the clock. Medical stations staffed by Navy corpsmen treated minor injuries without workers leaving the facility. Transportation buses ran on coordinated schedules to move workers between the yard and housing in Newport News and Hampton. Intrepid was launched in April 1943 and commissioned in August 1943, 20 months from keel laying to combat-ready status. By the time she joined the fleet, 2 more carriers were already under construction at the same yard, using techniques refined during her construction. Workers who had learned hull welding on Essex applied those skills to Yorktown. Workers who had installed aircraft elevators on Yorktown moved to Franklin and worked faster, having already solved the technical problems once. This industrial learning curve was invisible to Japanese intelligence. Their reconnaissance submarines occasionally photographed American shipyards from periscope depth, but these images showed hulls under construction without revealing the revolutionary work practices that made rapid construction possible. Their signals intelligence intercepted communications about carrier movements, but could not detect the systematic industrial efficiency that produced carriers at accelerating rates. Japanese planners made another critical error. They assumed American losses would slow production. When Hornet was sunk at Santa Cruz in October 1942, Japanese intelligence correctly reported the loss. What they failed to understand was that sinking one carrier did not delay construction of the next 6. American yards were not building replacement carriers in response to combat losses. They were building from contracts signed in 1940 and 1941. Before the war even began. The production pipeline was already full. Combat losses affected fleet strength temporarily, but did not affect construction schedules at all. By contrast, when Japan lost Shokaku and Zuikaku's sister ship candidates to resource constraints, those losses directly impacted fleet strength with no rapid replacement possible. Japanese yards could not expand production beyond existing capacity. Steel allocation went to other priorities. Skilled workers were drafted into the army, the industrial base that had seemed adequate in peacetime could not scale to meet wartime demands. The result was a grotesque mismatch that Japanese intelligence failed to recognize until it was too late. On June 18, 1944, that failure was about to become undeniable. The reconnaissance aircraft that shattered Japanese assumptions was a Nakajima C-6N Scion, Allied reporting name MERT, launched from the carrier Zuikaku at dawn on June 18th. Lieutenant Ito Zenji flew the long-range search pattern, his observer scanning the eastern horizon through powerful binoculars as they cruised at 8,000 feet. At 07:15 hours, they spotted the first American carriers. Ito counted carefully, circling at maximum range while his observer sketched the formation in a notebook. 4 large carriers in a rectangular formation surrounded by a screen of cruisers and destroyers. He photographed them with the aircraft's belly-mounted camera, the motor drive clicking as he made pass after pass. Then he turned north and continued the search pattern. At 0740 hours, another formation appeared. 3 more large carriers, again with heavy escort. Ito's hands were sweating inside his flight gloves. 7 carriers. The Americans were supposed to have perhaps 5 or 6 in the entire theater. He was looking at 7 in a single search sector. He continued north. At 0820 hours, he found the third formation. 4 more carriers, 3 large fleet carriers, and what appeared to be a light carrier. His observer was writing frantically in the notebook, updating ship counts, sketching relative positions. 11 carriers total. 11 confirmed visual sightings in 3 separate task groups. Ito turned west, heading back toward the Japanese fleet to report. As he crossed the final search sector, he spotted 1 more formation, 4 additional carriers, bringing the total to 15. 15 American carriers, in a single concentrated force, operating together with coordination that suggested months of practice and integration. Ito's observer showed him the notebook. The count was clear. There could be no mistake. They had photographed most of the formations. The intelligence officers would have visual evidence. When Ito landed aboard Zuikaku at 10:30 hours, he was rushed directly to the intelligence briefing room without even removing his flight suit. Staff officers listened to his report in silence. One asked if he was certain about the count. Ito was certain. His observer was certain. The photographs would confirm it when developed. The photographs were processed in the carrier's darkroom within an hour. They showed exactly what Ito had reported. Multiple formations of American carriers, each group containing 3 to 4 flatops, spread across hundreds of square miles of ocean but clearly operating as a coordinated force. Intelligence officers examined the photos with magnifying glasses, identifying individual ships by their island structures and flight deck configurations. Essex-class carriers, all of them. The distinctive profile was unmistakable. The narrow island set far to starboard, the large flight deck overhang, the grouped anti-aircraft batteries. Several light carriers as well. The Independence class with their cruiser hull origins evident in their narrower beam. Every carrier was modern, commissioned within the past 18 months. There were no old pre-war carriers in the formation, no Saratoga or Enterprise. Just new construction, vessel after vessel from American shipyards. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Admiral Ozawa examined the photographs personally. He had commanded carriers since the opening of the war. He knew American carrier profiles as well as he knew Japanese ships. There was no possibility of error. Task Force 58 contained 15 carriers minimum, possibly more operating beyond reconnaissance range. He asked his intelligence staff one question. How did American shipyards build this many carriers in 2 years? No one had an answer. The intelligence estimates had been wrong. Catastrophically, fundamentally wrong. The Americans had not simply replaced their Midway losses, they had expanded their carrier force beyond anything Japanese planners had conceived possible. The industrial capacity calculations that had seemed so reasonable in Tokyo were revealed as fantasy when confronted with photographic evidence of what American yards had actually produced. The full scope of American production became clear only when Japanese intelligence officers began correlating reconnaissance reports with captured documents and interrogation records from earlier battles. The picture that emerged was staggering. Newport News Shipbuilding had not built one carrier. They had built 6 Essex-class carriers by June 1944, with more under construction. Bethlehem Steel's Quincy Yard had built 2. Philadelphia Naval Shipyard had completed 2 more. Norfolk Naval Shipyard added another 3. The yards had not just maintained production, they had accelerated it, cutting construction times with each successive hull as workers became more experienced and efficient. American production records, captured later in the war, revealed the specific numbers. USS Essex, Kiel, laid April 1941. Commissioned December 1942, 20 months. USS Yorktown, Kiel, laid December 1941. Commissioned April 1943, 16 months. USS Intrepid, Kiel, laid December 1941. Commissioned August 1943, 20 months. USS Hornet, Kiel, laid August 1942. Commissioned November 1943, 15 months. USS Hancock, Kiel, laid January 1943, commissioned April 1944, 15 months. Each carrier represented approximately 35,000 tons of steel, miles of electrical wiring, thousands of distinct mechanical systems, and complex integration of propulsion, aviation fuel, ammunition storage, and habitability. Each required approximately 3 million man-hours of labor to construct. American yards were producing these vessels faster than Japan could build destroyers. The industrial disparity extended beyond mere numbers. American carriers embarked air groups of 80 to 90 aircraft, F-6F Hellcat fighters, SB-2C Helldiver dive bombers, TBF Avenger torpedo bombers. Each aircraft represented American production capacity. Grumman's Bethpage factory alone produced over 12,000 Hellcats during the war. By mid-1944, American aircraft production exceeded 40,000 planes per year across all types. Japan's total aircraft production for 1944 would reach 28,000 planes, impressive in absolute terms, catastrophically inadequate when compared to American output. The carriers also revealed American logistical sophistication. Task Force 58 operated with a fleet train of oilers, ammunition ships, and supply vessels that allowed continuous operations at sea for weeks without returning to port. Underway replenishment techniques, perfected through 2 years of Pacific operations, meant American carriers could refuel and rearm while steaming, maintaining pressure on Japanese positions without pause. Japanese carriers, by contrast, required return to port facilities for major replenishment, limiting operational tempo. Japanese intelligence officers examining the Task Force 58 formations noted another disturbing detail. The American carriers operated with 7 fast battleships as escort. These were not old pre-war battleships, but new construction Iowa and South Dakota class vessels, themselves representing industrial achievement Japan could not match. Each battleship displaced 45,000 tons and mounted 9 16-inch guns in 3 turrets. They could make 33 knots, fast enough to keep pace with the carriers. Their presence meant American carrier groups had integral, heavy surface firepower for shore bombardment and anti-aircraft defense. The disparity in destroyer escorts was equally stark. Task Force 58 operated with 58 destroyers, most of them Fletcher-class vessels commissioned within the past 2 years. American yards had produced 175 Fletcher-class destroyers during the war. completing them at rates of 4 or 5 per month at peak production. Japan's entire destroyer force at the start of 1944 numbered approximately 60 vessels, accumulated over 20 years of construction. When Admiral Ozawa's staff compiled the final intelligence estimate on the evening of June 18th, the numbers were inescapable. The Americans had more carriers in this single task force than Japan possessed in its entire navy. They had more destroyers escorting this single operation than Japan could assemble from all bases combined. They had more aircraft embarked on these 15 carriers than Japan could field from all land and sea bases in the Marianas. The decisive battle Japan had planned for was about to occur. But the Japanese had planned to fight 12 American carriers with 9 Japanese carriers supported by land-based aircraft. Instead, they faced 15 American carriers with their own land-based air support, already destroyed by 3 days of American strikes. The mathematics of the coming battle were brutally simple. Japan was outnumbered, outproduced, and facing an industrial capacity that had been systematically underestimated for 3 years. The Battle of the Philippine Sea commenced at dawn on June 19, 1944, when Japanese search planes located Task Force 58 approximately 200 miles west of Saipan. Admiral Ozawa, knowing his fleet was outnumbered, but committed to the decisive battle doctrine that had shaped Japanese naval strategy since before the war, ordered his carriers to launch everything they had. The first wave departed at 8:30 hours. 69 aircraft, 0 fighters, Judy dive bombers, and Jill torpedo bombers formed up and headed east toward the American fleet. They were followed by waves 2, 3, and 4 over the next several hours, until Ozawa had committed virtually every operational aircraft from his 9 carriers. 430 aircraft total, representing the striking power of the Imperial Japanese Navy's entire carrier force. American radar detected them at enormous range. The new SK air search radar sets aboard the carriers and escorting cruisers tracked the incoming raids while they were still 100 miles distant. Fighter directors vectored Hellcat fighters toward the intercept points with precision that Japanese pilots had never encountered. The Americans had time to launch additional fighters, time to position their combat air patrol, time to brief anti-aircraft crews on incoming headings and altitudes. What followed was slaughter. American Hellcat pilots, most with hundreds of hours of flight training and many with combat experience, engaged Japanese formations that included pilots with as little as 3 months total flight time. The disparity in training was as profound as the disparity in industrial production. American pilot training programs could afford to keep instructors stateside, rotating experienced combat pilots back to train new aviators. Japanese training programs had been forced to keep every experienced pilot in combat, with no reserve for instruction. When those experienced pilots died, their knowledge died with them. The aerial combat that American pilots would later nickname the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot destroyed Japanese naval aviation as an effective fighting force. By day's end on June 19th, the Japanese had lost 346 carrier aircraft. Additional losses from land-based aircraft brought total Japanese losses to approximately 475 planes. American losses: 23 aircraft in air-to-air combat. The ratio was 20-1. It was not a battle. It was annihilation. While Japanese aircraft were being destroyed in the air, American submarines were destroying Japanese carriers beneath the surface. USS Albacore fired a spread of torpedoes at the carrier Taiho, the newest and largest carrier in the Japanese fleet. One torpedo struck home. The initial damage appeared manageable, but poor damage control and a catastrophic aviation fuel vapor explosion tore the ship apart hours later. She sank in the early afternoon, taking with her Admiral Ozawa's staff and over 1,600 crew. USS Kavala torpedoed the carrier Shikaku, veteran of Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea and dozens of other operations. Multiple torpedo hits doomed the ship. She sank in the late afternoon with 1,200 men lost. In a single day, Japan lost 2 fleet carriers to submarines, while American aircraft methodically destroyed the Japanese air groups. On June 20th, American search planes finally located the retreating Japanese fleet. Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding Task Force 58, made the difficult decision to launch a long-range strike in late afternoon, knowing his aircraft would return after dark and many would run out of fuel. The strike damaged the carrier Hiyo badly enough that she sank later that evening. 2 oilers were also sunk. American losses: 80 aircraft, mostly to fuel exhaustion during the night recovery operations. Nearly all the pilots were rescued. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was over. Japan's mobile fleet had sortied with 9 carriers and 430 aircraft. It retreated with 6 carriers and approximately 35 operational aircraft. The Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier aviation capability had been effectively destroyed in 2 days of combat. The intelligence failure that led to the Philippine Sea disaster was not the result of incompetent analysis or lazy staff work. Japanese naval intelligence officers were skilled, dedicated professionals who had accurately tracked American movements and capabilities in previous campaigns. Their failure was more fundamental. They had made assumptions about American industrial capacity based on peacetime norms and Japanese experience, then interpreted all subsequent data through those assumptions. The post-war interrogations of surviving Japanese naval officers revealed the depth of this miscalculation. Captain Toshikazu Ohme, who served on the Naval General Staff in Tokyo, later explained that Japanese planners had studied American shipbuilding capacity extensively before the war. They knew American yards had greater absolute capacity than Japanese facilities, but they had calculated that specialized warship construction could not be rapidly scaled in the same way automobile production could be increased. A shipyard that built 1 carrier in 3 years could not simply build 3 carriers per year. The specialized skills, the complex systems, the integration requirements all seemed to preclude such rapid expansion. This assumption was wrong because it failed to account for American industrial culture. The United States had spent decades developing mass production techniques, standardizing components, training workers rapidly through systematic instruction, and applying engineering analysis to manufacturing processes. When these techniques were applied to warship construction, the results exceeded what Japanese planners had believed possible. Commander Masatake Okumiya, who had reviewed the reconnaissance photographs aboard Taiho on June 18th, survived the battle. In his post-war writings, he described the psychological impact of realizing that Japanese intelligence estimates had been so catastrophically incorrect. The reconnaissance data showing 15 carriers was not propaganda or deception. It was simple fact. American yards had built those carriers. American industry had supplied them with aircraft. American training programs had produced the pilots. The entire industrial and military system had operated at a scale Japanese planners had dismissed as impossible. The broader implications extended beyond carrier production. If American industry could produce 15 fleet carriers in 2 years, what else could it produce? The answer became apparent in subsequent campaigns. American yards produced 151 escort carriers during the war. Small, slow carriers built on merchant ship hulls specifically for convoy escort and amphibious support. Japan built no equivalent vessels. American factories produced 300,000 aircraft total during the war. Japan produced 76,000. American shipyards launched over 5,000 merchant ships under the Emergency Liberty Ship Program. Japan's merchant marine, essential for moving resources from conquered territories to the home islands, shrank steadily under American submarine attack with no ability to replace losses. The mathematical reality was inescapable. In a long war of industrial attrition, Japan could not win. The surprise was not that Japan eventually lost. Informed observers had understood that possibility since before Pearl Harbor. The surprise was how completely American industry dominated once fully mobilized. The 15 carriers of Task Force 58 were not the peak of American production. They were merely what had been completed by June 1944. More carriers were under construction. More aircraft were rolling off assembly lines. More pilots were progressing through training programs. For the Japanese officers who survived the Philippine Sea, this realization was crushing. They had fought bravely. Their tactics had been sound given the resources available. Their sailors and pilots had demonstrated courage and skill. But none of that mattered when the material disparity was 10 to 1 or greater. Individual excellence could not overcome systemic inadequacy. Training and spirit could not compensate for numerical inferiority in ships, aircraft, and weapons. The Battle of the Philippine Sea marked the point where this became undeniable. Japanese intelligence had underestimated American carrier strength by approximately 50%. They had expected 12 carriers and encountered 15. But even accurate intelligence would not have changed the outcome. Japan no longer possessed the industrial capacity to challenge American naval power in the Pacific. The final accounting of the Philippine Sea extended far beyond the immediate battle statistics. Japan's carrier aviation, built up over 2 decades and hardened through years of combat in China and the early Pacific campaigns, ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. The approximately 35 aircraft that survived from the original 430 represented skills and experience that could not be rapidly reconstituted. American pilot training programs in 1944 were graduating thousands of aviators annually from programs that provided over 2 years of instruction, hundreds of flight hours, and progressive training in formation flying, navigation, gunnery, and carrier operations. Japanese training programs, crippled by fuel shortages and the loss of experienced instructors, were producing pilots with minimal flight time and almost no advanced training. Some Japanese pilots sent to operational squadrons in late 1944 had less than 100 hours total flight time, barely enough to take off and land safely, let alone engage in combat. The carriers themselves, the 6 that survived the Philippine Sea, operated for the remainder of the war primarily as decoys. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, Admiral Ozawa commanded a carrier force that sortied with only 108 aircraft total, spread across 6 carriers that normally would have embarked over 400 planes. His mission was not to attack American forces, but to serve as bait, luring American carriers away from the main Japanese battleship attack. The plan failed, but it illustrated how far Japanese carrier aviation had fallen, from primary striking arm to sacrificial decoy in just 4 months. The intelligence failure that preceded the Philippine Sea had consequences beyond the naval battle itself. Japanese military planning for the remainder of the war was haunted by the knowledge that their intelligence assessments of American capability had been fundamentally wrong. If they had miscalculated American carrier production by 50%, what else had they miscalculated? American landing craft production? Artillery shell manufacturing? The number of divisions being trained? Every intelligence estimate became suspect, every operational plan questionable. Lieutenant Commander Okumiya, reflecting on the battle decades later, wrote that the reconnaissance photographs of June 18th represented the moment when Japanese naval strategy died. Not when the carriers were sunk or the aircraft destroyed. Those were tactical defeats. The strategic defeat came when Japanese officers looked at photographic evidence of 15 American carriers and understood that everything they had been told about relative industrial capacity was wrong. American shipyards could build carriers faster than Japan could sink them. American aircraft factories could produce planes in quantities that made replacement of combat losses almost trivial. American industrial capacity, fully mobilized, was not 2 or 3 times Japanese capacity. It was 10 times, 20 times, operating at a scale that made prolonged resistance futile. The story of Japanese intelligence counting the Pacific Fleet and finding 10 times more carriers than expected is not precisely accurate in literal terms.
They found 15 carriers when expecting perhaps 12. But the broader truth the story captures is accurate. Japanese planners fundamentally underestimated American industrial capacity, and when reality collided with those expectations in the Philippine Sea, the result was catastrophic. That reconnaissance flight on June 18, 1944, the photographs developed in Zukaku's darkroom, the staff officers counting carriers in formation after formation. These represented the moment when Japanese naval aviation confronted the cost of strategic miscalculation. They had gone to war against an industrial power whose production capacity they did not understand. They had planned for a decisive battle based on assumptions about American shipbuilding that were wrong. And when the truth became undeniable, photographed and counted and impossible to dismiss, it was far too late to change the outcome. The 15 carriers steaming west of Saipan were not just ships. They were evidence of an industrial system operating at capacity Japan had never imagined possible, crewed by men whose training programs reflected resources Japan could not match, launching aircraft produced at rates Japan could not approach. They were, in the end, proof that the war had been lost before it began. Lost not on the battlefield, but in the shipyards, the aircraft factories, and the training programs that American industrial capacity supported, and Japanese industrial limitations could never equal. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.